Part 1, Understanding Grief. This is broken down into 3 parts. Part 1, Words are empty. Grief is a natural response to any real or perceived loss. This can include moving, separations, divorce, rejection, disappointment, bullying, violence, abuse, death, illness, trauma, the list goes on. And our grief may be loss that we're dealing with today, or it could be loss that we're dealing with from our past. How we handled them back then can even influence how we handle grief today. And how we see others respond to grief can have a major impact on how we deal with it. Grief brings about this new reality where everything changes and everything is different. And the way to acknowledge this is to just tell the truth about your grief, saying that my loss is exactly as bad as I think it is. Any positive or comforting words will oftentimes mean nothing because there's no making grief better. It's hard, it's painful, it's hurtful. You fill in the blank. People will look at grief as such a bad thing because it hurts, and then will focus on removing the pain or waiting until the moment where there is no pain. We look at grief as something to just remove ASAP. And whether that focus is clearly stated or not, it is one of the main reasons why words of comfort usually feel anything but that during a time of grief. There's a quote from one of the books I pulled this lesson plan from, which you'll see the books down in the description of these videos, that says, "When you choose to find meaning or grow inside your loss, that's an act of personal sovereignty and self-knowledge. When someone else ascribes to growth or meaning to your loss, it diminishes your power, gives subtle shaming or judgment to who you were before and tell you that you need this somehow." And we've talked about the emptiness of words now, but what about time? How long are we to grieve? Part 2 is called Grief is Timeless. We have this belief that in society, grief shouldn't last more than a couple months. And even medical doctors label grief that lasts more than 6 months as a disorder, including the feelings of still longing for the person that died, feelings of injustice, and a belief that the world will never go back to normal. There's a common thing you probably have heard about called the stages of grief. Developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, it says that the griever is expected to move through a series of clearly delineated stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and eventually arriving at acceptance as their grief work is completed. Later on in her life, she wrote that she really regrets how she wrote those stages and that people are mistaking them as being both linear and universal. Linear meaning it happens in that same order. Universal means it happens to everyone. The stages were actually meant to normalize and validate what someone might experience in the swirl that is the insanity of loss and death and grief. These stages were meant to give comfort, not create a cage. And to go through the grief process depends mainly on your individual experience, meaning you need to listen to your own reality. You need to acknowledge the pain, love, and loss. And you need to allow the truth of these things to exist without any artificial requirements. You may feel that grief will never end, or it's something that you just can't move on for. So how do you know when you're ready? Well, I want to encourage you to use something that's called the vomit metric and get your laughing out of the way. As you go through your grief journey and you're ready to see, and you think you're ready to take this next step, see how you feel. If you feel sick about it, then it's not time. It's never going to feel great overall, but this is a powerful tool for you to use. You will do what you need to do when you're ready to do it and not a moment before. And the last part we're going to talk about in this video is avoidant behavior. Repressing grief creates an internally unsustainable condition wherein we must medicate and manage how we feel in order to maintain this mask of happiness. Our grief attempts to be heard in any way possible, often showing up in substance abuse, anxiety, depression, and social isolation. Unheard pain helps continue cycles of abuse by trapping victims in a way of living out or displacing their trauma upon others. Our approaches to ourselves and our own grief are most useful, most loving, and kind. And when we find ways to keep our hearts open in the heart of the nightmare, to not lose sight of love through all the chaos, we have to be willing to stop discrediting our own pain so that others can feel comfortable around us. We'll be back next week to look at the insides of what your grieving heart looks like. Stay blessed.